The Israelis have long prodded or attempted to prod the United States, going all the way back to the Bush administration, into a war with Iran. And remember that the Israel lobby was fundamental to pushing the United States into a war with Iraq. All of these neocons, Wolfowitz, Pearl, Louis Scooter Libby, they were also extremely close to the Zionist lobby. So it's a very foolish, dangerous provocation. I think the restraint has been shown not by Israel, of course, or even the United States, which has deployed warships to the Persian Gulf, but by Iran and by Hezbollah. Yes, I was at the hearing. This was Julian's last attempt within the British system to avoid extradition. The two-judge panel asked the United States for assurances that Julian, if he was extradited, would not be subject to the death penalty and would be granted First Amendment rights, although he's an Australian citizen. My favorite story was I covered Ron Brown's plane crash, and I actually got to the crash site very soon. It was pouring rain up in the mountains, and everyone was dead. And I called it into the New York Times, and the foreign desk said, oh, well, his name was Johnny Apple. His sources in the Pentagon say it crashed in the sea and people survived. And I go, oh, no, I just was at the crash. But the first edition, they ran with his story. So he wasn't even there.
Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. Today we have with us Chris Hedges. Chris Hedges is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who was a foreign correspondent and bureau chief in the Middle East and the Balkans for 15 years for the New York Times. He has taught at Columbia University, New York University, Princeton University, and the University of Toronto. He has taught college credit courses through Rutgers University in the New Jersey prison system since 2013. Chris, welcome to India and Global Left.
Thank you.
I want to start with Palestine. War has been so central to all your writings, if not all your writings, to most of the books I have read about you. How would you describe what's going on in Gaza at the moment?
Genocide, it's not war. When you make war against a population, that's genocide. We always, we use that term to describe the conflict, but it's pretty much a misnomer. Hamas, which is a resistance force, but it doesn't have any armored units or Navy, Air Force, artillery, tanks. It's so lightly armed that every time Israel carries out one of its periodic assaults against Gaza, it's butchery. And of course, most of the casualties, both in the past and then certainly in the present, are civilians. Hamas is largely sheltered in tunnels. U.S. intelligence estimates that only a third of its force has been killed. Meanwhile, we're seeing literally hundreds of Palestinians wounded and killed a day. And just to put that in perspective, I was in Sarajevo during the war. So we were hit with 300 to 400 shells a day. That resulted in about 4 to 5 dead a day or 24 wounded a day. Compare that to Gaza, and you begin to understand the level of decimation and bombing, which is it's unlike anything we've seen. So you'd have to go back to Vietnam. With this caveat, Gaza is tiny. It's only 20 miles long and 5 miles wide. So it's a live streamed genocide.
In your recent column, A Genocide Foretold, you have argued, kind of argued that the assault on Gaza and the resistance by Palestinians' freedom struggle represent the kind of global divide between the imperialist Western power on one hand and the resistance for the global South on the other hand. Why do you think Gaza represents this long-standing global divide?
Well, two reasons. One, Western governments, which I would count Israel as certainly part of that, group, these industrial fortresses, have stopped playing by any rules. We saw that for 20 years in the Middle East. Preemptive war under post-Nuremberg laws is a criminal war of aggression. Israel just bombed the consulate in Damascus. The United States carries out those kind of attacks across the demarcation lines of other countries all the time. Nobody is held accountable. That's the first part. So it's a world in which the powerful no longer even pretend to play by rules. Number two, with the rise of the climate crisis, the mass migrations, the decline in crop yields, the flooding, the wildfires, things are becoming harder and harder for those in the global south. And the response of the industrialized north will be no different from the response in Gaza as things deteriorate. And I think many people in the global south have figured that out. First of all, many of them in India, Kenya, all sorts of countries were themselves victors of settler colonial projects, so they get it. I think one of the reasons Yemen, which is the only country to respond in a meaningful way to the genocide, in their very recent history through this Saudi-U.S. siege, lost 30,000 people to starvation, cholera epidemics. So within their immediate memory, they know exactly what the Palestinians are going through, but within even the kind of the long trauma that's been passed down by settler colonial states like Great Britain in India, there's an acute awareness that this is very similar to what they remember. The British orchestrated a huge famine in India by seizing all of the local grain stores and building railroads to ship all the wheat out. So it's, I think the global South's response to what's happening in Palestine comes from historical memory and from a realization that as things deteriorate, they are not immune in any way from being treated like this.
Tell us a little bit about your reading of the popular protest in the U.S. and its influence on Washington as far as this genocide, as far as Washington's support in this genocide is concerned.
Well, it's had a rhetorical influence. It hasn't had any influence in terms of the pipeline between the United States and Israel. But I think it's about 68% of munitions that Israel uses, because they've depleted their stocks, are now coming from the United States. So that pipeline has not in any way been disrupted, nor will it be disrupted. But it has frightened the Biden administration, because all of the opinion polls between Biden and Trump are, the differences are like 1, 2, 3%. They're very small. So he can't afford to lose much. He's alienated the Muslim American community in the United States. He's alienated the youth who largely have driven these demonstrations. I mean, that's what's been so heartening, having attended several of them, is that they are driven by young men and women in their 20s, very young. And not only have they been sustained over a long period of time, but they haven't diminished in terms of numbers. And so that frightens, I think, the Democratic Party that is running an election that's on a razor's edge. But in terms of actually affecting policy, getting the United States to shut off the arms supplies, the weapon supplies, we just shipped F-35 fighters to Israel, that's not going to happen. And unfortunately, that means the genocide will continue. So there's been a rhetorical shift, but there hasn't been a meaningful shift, and there won't be.
During the Vietnam War protests, the protests did yield results. I mean, there were economic reasons at the time because because of increasing U.S. deficit, its problem with the gold standard, and so on and so forth. But also the conscription. American soldiers are fighting on ground. We are not seeing that here. Is this why so many protests, whether it's the university campus or organized labor, in this particular case, doesn't yield anything? What was the reason?
Well, the reason is the Israel lobby, which is a powerful political force in the United States, and let's never forget that Biden in the Senate was the largest recipient of money from AIPAC, from the Zionist lobby, to date, and he left the Senate a while ago to serve as vice president and now be president. So uh, they cannot alienate the Zionist lobby. That's why the weapons won't stop. The Vietnam War was very different. You had middle class kids because there was a draft coming home in body bags in pretty high numbers, um, and uh, and so the ferment, the political ferment on the streets was far more pronounced and far more, and saw a rise of a series of anti-war candidates, including George McGovern, who won the Democratic nomination in 1972. Now you saw both the establishment wing of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party join forces to defeat McGovern, much as we have seen the establishment wing of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party join forces against Trump, which exposes the fact that they're really just one big ruling party. Um, uh, so it is different. I think that these protests are not as uh, they're not as threatening to the political establishment as the Vietnam War. Remember, the political system itself was being changed under assault. We also, which is a kind of footnote often, but shouldn't be, there were a series of revolts within the military of soldiers who refused to serve. I think it was an estimated 25% of officers were killed with fragging. That means they were shot by their own soldiers. So there was, we were facing also mutinous conditions within the armed forces.
How do you look at the constant Israeli attempt to extend this conflict, if you like, to Iran essentially and their allies? You mentioned about the recent attack on the Iranian consulate in Damascus. This was followed after the air raid in Aleppo. There has been constant provocations along the Lebanon-Israeli border. Two hypotheses have been proposed that I have read. One is that it somehow benefits Netanyahu, who is himself facing a lot of troubles in his own constituency. And the other is that American support when it comes to the Iranian policy is very, very solid. So while Americans can say that we don't support the attacks on the aid workers, when it comes to Iran, it's an ironclad support. Uh, how do you look at this Israeli constant provocation to expand the war beyond Palestine?
Well, the Israelis have long prodded or attempted to prod the United States, going all the way back to the Bush administration, into a war with Iran. And remember that the Israel lobby was fundamental to pushing the United States into a war with Iraq. All of these neocons, Wolfowitz, Pearl, Louis Scooter Libby, they were also extremely close to the Zionist lobby. So it's a very foolish, dangerous provocation. I think the restraint has been shown not by Israel, of course, but or even the United States, which has deployed warships to the Persian Gulf, but by Iran and by Hezbollah. Hezbollah does not want a repeat of 1982 in Lebanon, where West Beirut was flattened by the Israeli Air Force. Iran is very wary about getting into a direct conflict. They will do it through proxies, like through Hezbollah. So I think that's where the restraint has come from. However, Israel keeps pushing and baiting Iran, provoking Iran to respond. They are going to have to respond somehow. How calibrated that response will determine whether we escalate the conflict or not. But I would say that certainly since October 7th, Hezbollah and Iran have shown incredible restraint. The real acts of resistance have come, as I said before, from Yemen, almost solely from Yemen. Yes, it's true that Hezbollah has shelled the northern part of Israel, and I think 80,000 Israelis have had to move, and a few people have been killed. But given the capacity that Hezbollah militarily has, they have shown tremendous restraint.
There are some, including not as much military experts, like I'm thinking of people like Norman Finkelstein, who says that the combined power of Hezbollah, Iran, and the other allies it has in the region would be something that Israeli army cannot match. Do you buy that argument?
Well, I don't. I think that any conflict between Israel and Iran would be in the air. I don't see Iranian troops storming through Syria to attack Israel. So as long as it is essentially an aerial conflict, no, I would disagree. Um, and I don't see Hezbollah storming over the northern border of Israel into Israel either. So I think what we're talking about is perhaps a ground incursion by Israel into southern Lebanon. Um, but I don't see this as a war actually between armies. Logistically, I'm not sure how that would work. And number one. Number two, I don't think they want it. So I'm not sure I agree with that analysis because Israel supplied by, Israel supplied by the United States, as we've seen in Gaza, can sustain over the long period a pretty formidable air campaign.
I want to move to other areas, but just a final question on the Middle East. We had Ambassador Chas Freeman, and he argued that, as you just said, that the American involvement in Iraq was significantly instigated by Israel. Thinking about, you have been covering the Middle East for a long time, thinking about American involvement in the region and the instability it has created all over. Uh, is it fair to blame just Israel when it comes to the American involvement in the region?
No, I don't think. I think Israel and the United States were full partners in these debacles, but they were full partners, and we had Israel. I mean, there's all sorts of fingerprints of Israel in Iraq, including in Abu Ghraib. So uh, yeah, I'm not saying that Israel was the sole engine for what happened in Iraq, but it was an important and a primary player in terms of pushing the United States into the war. Remember, we're talking about the first Iraq war, the invasion of Iraq. There was heavy opposition within the State Department, the CIA, even within the military. The Arabists were not behind this war, and so what you had is Dick Cheney, who was Secretary of Defense, creating his own kind of rogue unit to cook intelligence to pass it on to the White House. And Israel was deeply involved in that. That's a little caveat that I think a lot of people miss, that the establishment was not supportive of the war. And I know that because I was brought to these institutions to speak against the war, including the State Department at West Point, and they knew what I was going to say. They couldn't say it, but they knew what I was going to say. And Israel was deeply involved in all of that. That subterfuge, those lies about weapons of mass destruction, the whole fantasy of first Baghdad and then Tehran. Israel was deeply involved in all of that, and the architects of the war had very, very close links to Israel and the Zionist lobby.
It is said that somewhere in the middle of the 1990s, during the Clinton administration, there was a shift in American foreign policy in the Middle East from balancing Iran and Iraq to double containment of Iran and Iraq. And it is said that Israel was very significant in pushing forward this shift in American policy in the region.
Yeah, that's correct. And of course, it, it ended up being completely counterproductive because what it did is solidify a Shiite alliance between Baghdad and Tehran. And so the balance is gone. In many ways, Iran won the war. Quite literally, because we forget that with ISIS, which is Sunni, when they rose up, they were militarily increasingly dominant, and you had all sorts of Iranian militias and probably Iranian uh, revolutionary guard forces crossing the border. There was a tacit alliance at a certain point between the United States and Iran to defeat ISIS and the Caliphate, and Iran played a significant part of that. And the Americans would I mean visually even see Iranian units and not fire on them because they were in tacit alliance. So and what we saw is because of course before under Saddam Hussein the Sunni minority dominated Iraq and was very pro-Western, and that has changed.
Right. I want to shift a little bit towards to discuss journalism and media. In one of our recent exchanges, you said you were visiting the UK for the trial of Julian Assange, if I read you correctly. There seems to be a sort of a plea deal by Biden. What has caused this change of attitude in Washington, and what does this mean? Does it mean dropping of all charges and Julian Assange might be able to roam freely, or does it mean just stopping the extradition while he continues to appeal in these courts and stay in the Belmarsh prison in London?
So there is reportedly a plea offer that will allow Julian to go free on, as I understand it, misdemeanor charges. I understand they're also hung up on one point. I don't know what that point is. Uh, well, yes, I was at the hearing. This was Julian's last attempt within the British system to avoid extradition. The two-judge panel um, asked the United States for assurances that Julian, if he was extradited, would not be subject to the death penalty and would be granted First Amendment rights, although he's an Australian citizen. Uh, if the United States offers those assurances, then it's possible that the two-judge panel could greenlight the extradition. If they do not, then it seems that he will get to appeal on these are not the substantial issues, whether it's a public interest offense or any of that is gone. But he could, on these technical issues, could appeal. So it would go back to the British courts. He, of course, is now, we just had the anniversary, 5 years in Belmarsh prison. He's in very precarious physical and psychological health. So all of that, I don't take too much of what Biden says as important. A question was shouted at him as to whether he would consider the Australian request by the parliament, which took the Australians a long time to do, but they finally did it. And he said it's under consideration. That doesn't mean anything really. But that, as far as my understanding of what's happening around Julian, that's where we are.
What has been the attitude of the Australian government in this regard?
Well, I think it's kind of gone on long enough. 7 years and trapped in the Ecuadorian embassy, and the only reason he was trapped there is because the UK would not give him safe passage from the embassy to the Heathrow airport. 5 years in Belmarsh on no charges. I mean, he ostensibly is held because uh, he was a didn't he laid down bail and then went into the embassy, and but that's traditionally a fine. It's or maybe a short 30 or 50 days. I think I read one where it was up to 50 days or something. Well, he's been 5 years in a high security prison. So the judicial farce, which is a whole nother issue, has been egregious from the beginning on many, many points. Charging an Australian citizen under the Espionage Act, the filming of his meetings by UC Global, which was the Spanish security firm in the embassy, between him and his lawyers, and then giving all of that surveillance to the CIA, eviscerating attorney-client privilege. I mean, in the bottom line is he didn't commit a crime. So the UK judicial system, and I've covered it from the beginning, often in London, and if not online, has just had to tie itself in knots to perpetuate this show trial, which is pretty transparent, I think, to most of the public. So I think the weight of the Australian request was important. Um, but in terms of the specifics or how it will play out, or even if it will play out, I don't know.
You worked in the New York Times for a very long time, and someone who is a regular reader of the New York Times, I always wanted to ask you about some of the inner workings of the Times. I mean, the New York Times, to my mind, is particularly egregious when it comes to foreign policy. I mean, on cultural issues, it's relatively progressive. On even things like minimum wages, it seems to be progressive, even though it never directs its assault on Wall Street or corporate capitalism. But when it comes to foreign affairs, it's like it appears very right wing. Uh, Tell us what did you feel when you were working as a correspondent in the Times, and probably a little bit about how has the Times changed in the last 2 decades, if at all.
So I purposefully, even before I was with the Times, because I covered the war in El Salvador for 5 years, but not for the New York Times. As a reporter, I put myself in very extreme situations where there was horrible oppression being meted out towards a particular population, whether that was in El Salvador, Guatemala, Gaza. And I, of course, ended up in Sarajevo. So I was physically there where people were being butchered and deprived of food and any kind of security. So uh, that was a conscious decision on my part um, to use the megaphone or the platform of the New York Times to give those people a voice. Remember, American journalism, unlike Indian journalism, is very constrictive in terms of its form. It's really basic facts, um, and you're not allowed in any way to editorialize, which I would say, or even put what you're seeing in much context. But for instance, if Israel,
You are talking about the reports of the correspondents, and not necessarily the Thomas Friedmans and the Brett
yeah,
Stephen.
yeah, those people are
Yeah,
columnists. So, and those people are all cheerleaders for empire. Of course, that's
right.
how. So, but I used it as a weapon against uh, these often U.S. backed forces like Israel, like the Salvadoran military, where I would often at some risk uh, be at a place where people were killed. And if I had the dates, the times, the names, I mean, I can remember covering the war in Kosovo, and there was a charge that I think it was 24 men had been seized from a village, and they'd all been tortured, and the bodies were supposed to come back to the village. And the Serbs, because you don't travel in a war zone, you don't travel at night. It's too dangerous. You travel only in daylight hours. So they didn't bring the bodies back until nightfall. And in the end, I was the only journalist who stayed. I had to stay there the whole night. And when the truck came in, I climbed into the back of the truck with a mag light and rolled back the blankets that were covering these dead bodies to actually look at every single face to see whether they were mutilated or not. They were. They had been horribly tortured. That there's the Times is forced at that point to publish a story like that, and it deeply angers the Serbs. Wes Clark, who was the head of NATO, told me the Serbs were going to assassinate me. It deeply angers the Israelis when I did that, but the Times will run it. That's how I worked within the institution. My problem came when I went back to the United States and started denouncing publicly the calls to invade Iraq. That was a red line. I knew what I was doing. I mean, I'd been there 15 years. That was a red line a reporter's not supposed to cross. I was given a formal written reprimand, told not to speak out about the war, and then left the paper. So, but because I put myself into extreme situations, I was able to do journalistic work that I think had integrity. But yeah, you're right. Of course, most of the reporters. I remember when I told the executive editor that I wanted to go to Sarajevo, he said, "Well, the line starts and ends with you," because the European correspondents had actually sent a letter saying they wouldn't go to Sarajevo because it was too dangerous. But I never did that kind of reporting. I was never in London, or I didn't interview. When I was the Middle East bureau chief, yes, I had to interview heads of state, Mubarak, King Hussein. I interviewed Gaddafi a couple times, but that was not a part of the job I particularly liked or felt was important. But you have journalists at the New York Times who their entire career is spent as stenographers for the powerful. But that isn't what I did.
Who calls the shot? Is it the editorial board who internalizes the world through the lens of what they offer, or are there direct interventions from shareholders who might necessarily have, monetary interest with the larger empire and so on?
No, it doesn't work like that. The editorial board is largely separate. You don't get on to the editorial board unless you're going to parrot back the opinions they want. First of all, the big nemesis for those of us who are reporting overseas was the Washington bureau, because the reporters in Washington, they they have sources within the power structure that leak them material. It's often wrong, and they don't want those sources alienated. So you're often, if you're reporting out of the war in Salvador, if you're reporting out of Gaza, you're in conflict directly with the Washington bureau. I mean, my favorite story was I covered Ron Brown's plane crash, and I was actually got to the crash site very soon. It was pouring rain up in the mountains, and everyone was dead. And I called it into the New York Times, and the foreign desk said, "Oh well, his name was Johnny Apple. His sources in the Pentagon say it crashed in the sea and people survived." And I go, "Oh no, I just was at the crowd." But the first edition, they ran with his story, so he wasn't even there. So that is kind of classic. The power of the Mandarins, political class, intelligence community in Washington to influence the coverage of the paper is quite pronounced. And you would often have reports that I would write out of the field, and then to quote unquote balance it out, you'd have reports based on administration officials that said the direct opposite. So it was a way to kind of neutralize the reporting, but all the good foreign correspondents were in constant conflict, and the nemesis was Washington. It wasn't the editorial board. In terms of the influence, I mean, the shareholders, not so much, because the publisher and the senior editors will have direct contact with the highest levels of government. And what they will do is then mount a campaign against an individual reporter, which happened to me in Bosnia through the Clinton administration, that they will attempt to discredit. And they will do that by having meetings with the executive editor or with the publisher. And this is how good reporters who won't bend finally get driven out. David Halberstam in Vietnam, et cetera, et cetera. That's how it works. Sidney Schanberg, who was a friend of mine, who covered Cambodia, won the Pulitzer, came back, and they put him as the editor on the Metro desk, and he started writing about all the real estate firms and developers who were driving out the working and middle class from Manhattan. And then all these real estate developers, of course, were friends of the publisher, and he was pushed out. So that's how it is. Not so much the shareholders, and the influence of the money classes is opaque. You don't see it directly. It's not like the way the rich Zionist donors will get rid of the president of Harvard. That's all very public. This is all very quiet because, of course, it would tarnish their journalistic credibility. But that's how it works internally. I mean, and I would just say at the end, most reporters who get to the Times are careerists. They understand internally how the system works, and they're not about to damage their careers. So the primary form of censorship is self-censorship. And then it's those few reporters like myself who are management headaches who they eventually get rid of.
Would you say they still exist, and it's a constant process, like these few reporters that you referred to, or do you think they don't exist anymore?
No, there are probably some there, but the Times has changed. I mean, that gets into the issue of the economic model of all newspapers has collapsed. So the monopoly that newsprint once had to connect sellers with buyers is gone with the rise of the internet. Classified ads, which used to be 40% newspaper revenue, is gone. So the papers are economically far more distressed. They don't want to lose what advertisers they have, so they become far more cautious. There used to be in the newsroom place for kind of renegade reporters like myself. I don't think that place is there anymore. I mean, the example would be Steve Donziger, the lawyer who won the settlement in Ecuador for the indigenous. Chevron mounted this incredible campaign to get him disbarred under house arrest, on and on and on. And the Times never covered it. They never covered it because they run an advertising agency called I think it's called T-Mobile or something, and where they produce the in-house ads, and their biggest client is Chevron. I mean, I actually confronted the executive editor over it, and he got very indignant. But yeah, the way they did it, or like when the case was settled, it was like a very short pro forma story, but they never covered the campaign of Chevron against Donziger. I mean, I used to say that the real motto of the New York Times is do not significantly alienate those on whom we depend for access and money. Because reporters who have spent their entire careers writing propaganda do extremely well if they have access. The Times hates it when you lose access. I mean, the Mubarak government got angry at me. It wouldn't give me interviews. I mean, what did Mubarak ever say that anybody wanted to read? Nothing. But the fact that I didn't have that access hurt me.
This is very interesting because one of the impression that the Times offers, unlike the cable TV media, which is very transparent that they are based on access, access to personality figures. The Times also gives this impression that they produce very meticulous reports, and they also have apparently a large subscriptions, which is perhaps very unique because a lot of newspapers don't have that model, but you are saying that it's basically access journalism, which is not different from what we see in the television, cable media, the CNNs and the
Oh,
others.
the difference is the New York Times sets the agenda. So the television reads the Times, then they decide what to report. At least that's how it was in my day. Well, in terms of subscriptions, their print subscriptions are way down. They have digital subscriptions.
Right.
Uh, Number one, they don't bring in as much money, but number two, they're far more unreliable in terms of the long term. So, with the rise of Trump, their digital subscription base rose significantly. Again, they're still not bringing in the kind of money that they used to bring in. And from surveys, they knew that most people signed on to the Times because they hated Trump. So that's the siloing of the media now, where you cater to a particular demographic. That's the new model of media, essentially driven by the internet. They become echo chambers. So they do 2 years of Trump is a Russian asset and RussiaGate, all of which is false, but they don't pay a price for it because that's what their readers want to hear. They're catering to uh, to a base that is important to them economically, and that's deteriorated the quality of the journalism. We had the Caliphate, which was this ridiculous podcast, because of course they're trying to be hip now and do podcasts based on a con artist who said he was a member of, I believe, ISIS or something. I mean, I listened to a little bit of it, having spent 7 years in the Middle East, and you knew instantly it was fiction. I mean, it was just kind of audio porn, nailing people to crosses. I mean, it was ridiculous. It just wouldn't happen. And then of course we have this unsubstantiated stories of systematic rape on October 7th. So I mean, a series of weapons of mass destruction. I mean, there's been a series of horrific. I mean, they went through a whole thing with the rise of Trump. They decided that the reason Trump took power was because of race, um, and because white Americans were racist. No, it had to do with the fact that 30 million Americans have lost their jobs in mass layoffs since 1996, and the Democratic Party with full-throated support of this outsourcing and deindustrialization. So, I mean, that's, but of course, if they went that route, then they would have to go after their corporations who are and private equity firms and everything else that are their major advertisers. So I would say there's been a terrible deterioration. I mean, the paper was always elitist. It used to be careful about facts. I mean, you wouldn't I mean, that's what we do as journalists. Let's be clear. We manipulate facts. I can take a set of facts and spin a story any way you want. It's factually correct. If I'm honest and I care about the truth, I will select those facts that seek to impart the truth. But if I'm a careerist or I'm serving moneyed interests or power, I will select those facts and manipulate them in such a way to serve the interests of the powerful. And that's the difference between good and bad journalism. But we all manipulate facts. We select the facts we want for the story and we spin it. I mean, I can spin a story with the same set of facts any way you want. Um, so yeah, the Times used to be careful about the facts. It used to be careful just in terms of copy editing. You didn't see grammatical errors. You didn't. Now you do. Now you see factual errors, and that has been, as they've drained the newsroom. Every desk used to have its own copy desk. The foreign desk had a copy desk, which honestly saved me innumerable times from making mistakes because those men and women had been on that desk for often years. When I wrote about Oslo, they knew what Oslo was. So it wasn't just grammatical and typographical or factual, but it was also context. They understood the story. Now all those desks have been eradicated, and there's just one central copy desk with probably not a lot of expertise on those issues, and a lot more gets through. So there's been a decline in the quality of the journalism. I think that's pretty, for those of us who follow the Times closely, very, very pronounced and very, disturbing.
What are your thoughts about the rise of the internet as a media space, as a space for independent journalism? There's a lot going on India, but also a whole range of issues all over the world. Uh, do you see the internet primarily as a space of disinformation, or do you think that there are progressive channels, podcasts, individual voices uh, that have been able to impart any positive influence on our politics?
Well, of course there are. I mean, programs like yours, of course. And I have my own program, the Chris Hedges Report, which gets hundreds of thousands of views on YouTube. I'm often over 1 million. But that's commentary. The problem with the internet is we're not getting reporting because reporting is expensive. I wish I could do more reporting, but especially investigative reporting. After 9/11, I was based in Paris. I covered Al Qaeda. I think I only wrote 5 stories. I mean, some of those stories were 5,000 words, but it took weeks and weeks and weeks to put it together. And all the expenses of being in a hotel and travel and plane and everything else, plus my salary. So unfortunately, that's the problem with the internet. We've not found a system which we can sustain good reporting, and all these newspapers, regional newspapers that have collapsed. And again, they were constrained by commercial interests. However, they had a reporter who covered the courts, went to police, covered the mayor, the town hall. That's gone. They're gone. And when you shroud centers of power, even small centers of power, in secrecy, that's when corruption runs rampant and abuse of power runs rampant. And that's what worries me the most. That the internet has not found a way to remunerate reporters to do their job. Is there good commentary? Yes, there is. Um, but my commentary, when I'm almost 68, I mean, so I spent decades as a reporter. in places like Gaza, like Latin America, 6 years in Latin America. And I can build on that, but I don't know that young reporters are going to, I don't know how they're going to have that experience because, especially if you're covering a war. Covering a war is very expensive unless you have a suicide wish. I mean, it requires armored cars. My armored cars were running 100,000 a piece, body armor, satellite phones, etc. So I've seen, especially in foreign reporting, we have very courageous. I don't want in any way diminish the very courageous reporting of the Palestinian journalists in Gaza, and of course Israel's locked out the foreign press. And I went to Cairo to go with the Egyptian press syndicate up to Rafah to protest, but the Sisi government, which is working very closely with Washington and Israel, blocked us. Uh, so, and then of course we've had over 100 Palestinian journalists killed, and that's not an accident. I mean, these people have been targeted. So, yeah, that's what worries me. I mean, the internet, people go to their own echo chamber, the right, wherever they are. I mean, self-selective. That's the difference in the old media model, where you would get a newspaper, and the newspaper would try to serve a broad, general, kind of middle brow public to reach as many people as they could, but at least you would not always have your belief system reinforced. That's changed, and it's changed at the New York Times. It's changed at I think what 94% or something of people who watch MSNBC, which is garbage, or identify as Democrats. This roughly the same percentage who watch Fox identify as Republicans. But what you're creating are these divides, these social, cultural, political divides, where you have competing narratives, which are often both false, but make it impossible to communicate. So Trump did not become president because of Russia. But that is something that the Democratic Party and liberals will grasp onto. Uh, and so that's kind of their non-reality based belief system. I mean, you have Paul Krugman in the New York Times, a columnist, attacking the white working class. They've written them off as deplorables and racists and bigots. And of course, some of them are. But that's not why they voted for Trump. That's not why Trump rose to power. It was the betrayal on the part of the liberal establishment and the Democratic Party that that made people very legitimately angry. And half of my family comes from the working class in Maine. Their towns are a wreck. I mean, the mills are gone, the banks are boarded up, etc. So you have two competing systems that essentially are grounded in non-reality based belief systems. And that's very, very dangerous because you're never going to confront the problem. I mean, after Trump was elected, the New York Times decided the issue was race. So all they did was run stories about identity and race, and as if, that's why Trump was there. And they ignored the issue. They ignored the fundamental issue. And of course, they ignored it because they're dependent upon the very forces that betrayed the working class, these large corporations and the billionaire class. So that worries me. I mean, I saw the same thing in the former Yugoslavia, where the groups broke down around ethnic identities and created their own narratives, all of which were false. But we're doing the same thing here. And then, of course, we'll add the fact that the country is awash in assault weapons. And we have
This
mass shootings. We have so many mass shootings; they're not even news anymore.
Right. In some ways, this phenomenon is very global in nature. I would say some kind of substitution of class-based politics by identity politics. I mean, in India, what we are saying in terms of its economic policies is the billionaires get ports. These are all, privatization, giving long lease contracts, whether it's airports or seaports, while the poor are given 5 kgs of rice. That has been essentially, the Modi economics. Just as we are being told by Paul Krugman and others about Bidenomics, how successful it has been in terms of keeping employment low, inflation in check, and growth being about 3% or so. while not talking about how much of that has come from the stock markets, the massive inequality, and so on. I think this is a good segue into the election, which has been kind of low-key from outside. I remember you debating Robert Wright's, I guess, in Democracy Now! About the third about the third party or a third candidate. You have been long arguing that uh, the Democratic Party is not the lesser of the two evils, if you like. There is an other side, some people on the left as well, who says whether it's on climate change, whether it's on immigration, whether it's on minimum wage, or even in foreign policy when it comes to North Korea, when it comes to Israel, Iran, and so on, Cuba, the Republican Party is significantly worse. What's your response to that line of argument?
Well, in terms of foreign policy, there's complete consensus. I mean, the sanctions that Trump imposed on Cuba remain under Biden. The immigration policy under Biden is the same or worse. The Democratic Party is the war party. Look at Ukraine, look at Israel. And whatever opposition there is to the war in Ukraine comes from the Republican Party. It's a small minority, but it doesn't come from the Democratic Party. Uh, you no, I would say on foreign policy, they're completely in lockstep. The difference now, perhaps you could argue over Ukraine, which is predictably, I mean, I was one of the people who was very outspoken against arming Ukraine for the reasons we now know, in that Ukraine would never win a war of attrition against Russia. It's impossible. But that was never the intent. The U.S. Looked at Ukraine as a way to degrade the Russian military and isolate Putin, especially from Europe, and that worked. It had nothing to do with, they knew they couldn't win the war, and sending them M1 Abrams tanks was ridiculous. So it takes. I was in the last tank battle of the first Gulf War with M1 Abrams. It takes a really long time to learn how to coordinate tank units, even actually operate an M1 Abrams. They're very temperamental. So it was all a fiction, but the U.S. very cynically achieved its goals. There will be it may come sooner under Trump, but it's eventually going to come some kind of a negotiated deal, trade for land, for peace. All this could have been done before. Ukraine was devastated. Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians were killed, displaced. I mean, how many, 4 million refugees, et cetera, in Europe. So, yeah, it was very cynical. But I covered proxy wars run by the United States all over the world. It was just a classic proxy war, which did not serve the interests of Ukraine at all, but wasn't designed to. And that is bipartisan. That would have been done under Republicans or Democrats. So in terms of foreign policy, no, there's I mean, Trump moved, in violation of international law, moved the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Biden didn't move it back. I mean, so yeah, in terms of
What
domestically,
about Iran and China? Do you see any difference?
I mean, if there's a difference, Trump is less aggressive. I mean, I had despised Trump, of course, but Trump didn't start any wars. I don't want to defend the Trump presidency, but he's actually less aggressive than the Democrats. I mean, the thing about Trump is he doesn't really have any fixed positions. He's very impulsive. He's not very bright, although that's the other question: is how sentient Biden is. We don't know. So it's hard to know what his policy is. I don't think there's any question that in terms of Israel, there would be no difference. If you're Palestinian Gaza, make any difference whether it's Trump or Biden.
Right.
So, um, but yeah, no, the foreign policy establishment is pretty impervious to Republican or Democrat, whoever's in charge. It remains. That's the military machine in the United States, like we have 16 intelligence agencies. These are states within the state. They're untouchable. Um, they are not even Pentagon's not even audited anymore. So you can't. I mean, we had it was a couple of years ago. They passed the defense budget, and then Congress gave the Pentagon $40 billion more than they even asked for. I mean, it's lunacy. But this is also the symptom of late empire, as Arnold Toynbee and others historians point out, that unchecked militarism cannibalizes the country from within. So our trains don't work, our bridges are falling apart, our roads are a mess. Even the middle of Manhattan is just one pothole after another. Social services are eviscerated. You have tremendous poverty in the United States. And just to go back to your point about Krugman and unemployment, well, those figures are completely fictitious, because if you stop looking for work, I think it's after 6 weeks, you're removed from the unemployment figures. If you work an hour a week, you're counted as employed. So with the rise of the gig economy with no stability, no sustainable income, these people are all counted as employed. Well, this is very different from working in a GM factory in Anderson, Indiana, where you were unionized and you got $25, $30, $40 an hour, and you had a pension and benefits, and those don't exist, doesn't exist anymore. So that's all fictitious stuff. I don't know Krugman. I know Paul, but I mean, he spent his whole life in academia. I'd like to haul him up to Maine for a week, and he can talk to my relatives who've been devastated, and they vote for Trump. I mean, do they have racist opinions? I mean, they don't have a worldview that I share. Let me put it that way. But they have every right to be enraged. And their enrage is directed at a Democratic Party that once protected their interests. The county where my family is from in Maine, which is rural, very rural, they all voted for George McGovern in 1972. So it's about the lies that they were told and the betrayal that took place. The lies that Trump told, when he lies like he breathes, did not do as much damage to them as the lies the Democratic Party told. And that's why we are
Right.
where we are. And Biden was at the center of all of this. I mean, Biden was, you can just tick it off. Militarized police, expansion of prisons, NAFTA, deregulating the FCC, Glass-Steagall. I mean, he was out front, including calling for invading Iraq 5 years before they
Right.
invaded Iraq. So, yeah, that's why Biden was anointed, selected. That's why the Democratic establishment pushed all of the other candidates out of the primary in the last elections, because nobody wanted to vote for Biden. But then they finally made sure he had no choice, and they sabotaged the campaign of Bernie Sanders. And that is, I think, the final tragedy, that the possibility of reform through Sanders. Because remember, if that corporate money had been withdrawn, Biden wouldn't have had any financial support. He wouldn't have been able to run. But that gets into the whole system of legalized bribery that defines the U.S. electoral system. But I think Sanders could have beat Trump. It's interesting that, like, the UAW workers, all of whom had lost their jobs after NAFTA, they voted for Sanders in the primary, but then they voted for Trump in the general election.
I guess I I have two more questions, or maybe one. I wanted to ask you a little bit about the American prison system. Um, uh, the statistics about the American prison system is mind-boggling. I mean, the number of people, especially after the 70s, have increased. It's kind of, in deindustrialization coupled with more and more imprisonment. You have long worked, seen the prison system. Uh, what explains this disproportionate number of people, American people in American prisons, and what could be some of the way forward?
Well, it's a form of social control. So you deindustrialize urban pockets, and you sever the bonds, in essence, that workers have to a society. They have a stake in society. They believe that there's a certain amount of meritocracy. They're able to buy a home. All of that's gone. So the rupture of those bonds, I'm stealing this, of course, all from Emil Durkheim, means that uh, the society no longer has control over those figures. And so they have to find more draconian forms of control, and that becomes militarized police, internal armies of occupation, and a carceral system. And that's why it exists. We have 25% of the world's prison system. We're less than 5% of the world's population. And I would add, having taught in the system for a long time, these sentences are 3 or 4 times longer. Again, let's go back to Biden and Clinton. 3 strikes, you're outlaws. So we have people locked up for life because of drugs they didn't commit. I think 40% of the people in our prison system are not charged with carrying out a violent crime. But it's a form of social control. And they can't, 94% of the people in our prison system are forced to plea out. Because the court system would collapse if the poor were given, as they're supposed to, adequate legal representation. And then those, as often the ones I teach, the ones who didn't commit the crime, foolishly go into the court system, demand a trial. And what happens is you're charged with you got a series of charges, half or more of which the police and the prosecutors know are false, but they use them as bargaining chips. They love to always put kidnapping in because that's 25 years. So they'll say, okay, we'll take out the kidnapping, we'll take out this or that, and you plead. And that works. But if you go to court, they don't remove any of those charges. So the students that I teach with the longest prison sentences are, and usually the ones that are almost always innocent, are the ones that went to trial. And they're an example. Don't do it. Don't think about doing it. I mean, I just met a guy, wonderful guy at the gate. He did not commit the crime. He was offered a plea deal. I forget. I think they offered him 7 years or something. He refused to take it. He went to trial. He got 30 years. He spent 30 years in prison. And so, and they have to do that because the system wouldn't work. They coerce people into taking pleas. But at its core, it's social control. I mean, the same thing happened in the after the Civil War in the South. They used black codes, all sorts of laws to essentially criminalize the black population. And then, of course, what they did is just created slavery by another name, because they would arrest them on specious charges, vagrancy, whatever it was, especially when the cotton needed to be harvested. They would put them in, they call coffles, which are chains of 40 men chained together in a group, and then they would walk down the river and auction them off to plantation owners to do their work. And people could spend years essentially as convict leasing, it was called. August Wilson actually wrote a great play about it called Joe Turner Come and Gone. But it's a very, we the ghosts of our past are present in the, with us now. And I look at mass incarceration in the United States as the civil rights issue of our time. And one of the reasons I'd never vote for Biden is because when I walk into a prison classroom, at least 50% of the people wouldn't be there but for Joe Biden. And what he's done to their families and their children and their communities. I mean, this is not a mistake. This is devastating to millions of poor people. Most of the people I teach are, of course, of color. We've ripped apart their communities. We've destroyed the childhoods of their children. And then, because they're impoverished, they have no stable, they're constantly evicted. I mean, every 6 months. So it's lock up the men and evict the women and children. So when you actually spend as much time as I have in an environment like that, you come out enraged at figures like Biden.
What's the specificity of the U.S. system? Because I'm assuming the internal logic of the criminal justice system that you refer to, like if these men are not locked up, the bureaucracy would not be there in the first place, would be very universal, so to speak, right? But if we compare not just other industrial nations of Europe and US, but also with the global South, the rate is disproportionately high. I mean, one of the things, obviously, on a comparative scale with Europe is the extreme poverty of the bottom layer in US, which is very distinctive. And the other, perhaps, is the element of race. If you can brief what's unique to this system that can explain this disproportionate number.
Well, because in the United States, there's no safety net. When you fall all the way. There's no universal health care. If you have a felony, and most people get felonies pretty easily if you're poor, you are locked out of public housing. You are locked out of, you can't get anything that requires a license. You can't cut hair. You can't be a plumber. You can't. So it's a kind of, Michelle Alexander, wrote a good book, but it's called The New Jim Crow. In many ways, it is the new Jim Crow. It's a way to perpetuate a caste system that's always been there under another name. That's that's really what it is. There's a complete continuity. I mean, racism, caste, it's protean. It changes its shape, it changes its color, it changes its rhetoric, but doesn't go away.
I want to end this great show, I mean, great conversation with you by asking you a little bit about Islamophobia. We are in the middle of worst kind of Islamophobia in India. It has its own history, but there is also the global context of uh, explosion of Islamophobia with the war on terror in particular. You debated Sam Harris. I enjoyed that. I think you have also debated Christopher Hitchens and others. Um, I just wanted to ask you, because recently we had Lawrence Krauss in our show, and I confronted him. I never knew that a few weeks later Richard Dawkins would come up and make this clear admission about how he hates Islam. So this new atheist movement that starts by saying that we hate all religion, eventually it said we hate Islam in particular. Tell us a little bit about what did you feel having debated these people and how they became cheerleaders of American imperialism in Middle East in particular, but in general as well.
I didn't pay a lot of attention to them. I come out of the liberal church. I graduated from Harvard Divinity School. My father was a minister. My mother went to seminary. I mean, I grew up in a religious tradition, but very left wing, social gospel. My father was involved in the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement. He was a veteran of World War II, and the gay rights movement, for which the church was very unforgiving and finally pushed him out. My uncle was gay, and he and my dad were real close. Um, so I didn't pay attention to them particularly. But then I had to debate, as you said, Harris at UCLA, and then Berkeley. I debated Hitchens, so I had to read their works, and I was appalled. It was, first of all, they don't know anything about religion. They have a cartoon version of religion, and that's the only thing they can tear down. It's not a religious system that I embrace. I don't believe in angels. I don't really know if there's a heaven or a hell, or nor do I care particularly. So, but they can't. And when I've debated the Christian right, and I wrote a book on the Christian right called American Fascists, the Christian right on the war in America. And as I was debating Harris or debate, it was exactly the same as debating the Christian right. They constantly interrupt you because they can't argue about ideas. They've actually never read theology, Karl Barth, Tillich, Niebuhr. They don't know any of this stuff. It's not an exchange of ideas. As I sat on the stage, I felt as if I was debating a member of the Christian right, which I also did for my book, where they would just attack you. I mean, in the case of the Christian right, they said, well, you're just a secular humanist. Hitchens interrupts me and goes, shame on you for defending suicide bombers. And have never defended suicide bombers, etc. So I recognize the similarity. Chomsky recognized the similarity very early on. He called them, I forget the exact word Noam used, but it was something like fanatics for the state religion.
Right.
But that's what they are. So all of them came to fruition after 9/11. And if you look closely, they all got scared. It was all fear. They don't know anything about the Middle East. They don't know anything about Islam, but they suddenly wanted the U.S. Air Force to bomb every Muslim back to the Stone Age because they were frightened. And then after 9/11, you had a wave of persecutions of Muslims. I was involved in the cases of many, my friend Samuel Arian and others, the Holy Land Foundation, et cetera, many, by the way, Palestinian, because it was driven by Israel. And so there was, and then young Muslim kids were being hauled off of subways, and Their homes were being invaded and searched. I mean, it was, if you looked at what was happening to the Muslim community, it was quite traumatic. So uh, that fed a kind of racism that became acceptable within public discourse, a kind of demonizations of Muslims and Islam that constantly on the airwaves. I mean, it drove me crazy because these people had never been in the Middle East. I'm an Arabic speaker. They didn't know what they were talking about, but it catered to that racist narrative. And now, uh, that laid the kind of fertile ground for the Islamophobia that you're right is not only rippling through populations, but embraced by governments like the Modi government. The Germans, I mean, look at, if you really look at the history between Germany and Israel, it was a very dirty deal. And the deal was, we will arm you and fund you and defend your apartheid colonial settler state if you will rehabilitate us. And that was the deal.
Mm.
And that's what happened. And the Germans just switched their racist rhetoric, which had been directed towards Jews, towards racist rhetoric against Muslims. The DNA, unfortunately, is the same. And we have seen horrible suppression of dissent on behalf of the Palestinians in Germany, but not just, of course, in Germany. So, yeah, Islamophobia, I think, is tied quite intimately to the settler colonial project in Israel, because let's never forget that the settler colonial project in Israel is almost exclusively run by people of European descent. They're white. And so why does the Christian right embrace Israel? Well, because at its core, it's racist, and it sees in the subjugation of people of color, Palestinians, Arabs, a mirror image of their own racism. And I think that is why ruling elites and powerful entities like the Christian right are so fervently backing Israel, that it is a modern expression of traditional racism as espoused by settler colonial projects. I just read Caroline Elkin's book uh, on the Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya. And it's a good book, although I did check. She's not said anything about Gaza, but it's a good book. And you look at the British uh, brutality, and it matches not only in terms of rhetoric, but in terms of concentration camps and torture and wholesale executions, exactly what the Israelis do to the Palestinians. So,
Um, I'm very thankful for your time. If I can just take one more minute to ask one final question, it just came out of what you just said about your background. I Unlike you, I grew up in a very atheistic family. My dad was is a conscious atheist, and this was a very different background. And then obviously, the left politics influenced us. But over the years, having read Chinese history in particular, I have figured out uh, the the maybe not as much in Latin America, but in China, definitely in Russia, the left has not figured out a convincing answer to things like spirituality, things like religion. As someone who has read religion, studied religion, has this background, and also someone who owns the tradition of the left, how do you reconcile the two? What are you spiritual? What does spirituality mean to you?
well, I first of all would say the left did figure out a way to create its own religion. It was called communism.
Mhm.
It had its own saints, its own martyrs, its own paradise, etc. So it was just a religious system cloaked in another vocabulary. Martin Luther writes about this. He said, he doesn't believe in atheists, and that book that I wrote is it's I don't believe in atheists, and I think the hardback is When Atheism Becomes Religion. Now, that's the paperback, but anyway, it dissects the new atheist movement. I think pretty astutely, the London Review of Books said the most astute critique of anyone who took on the new atheists. But yeah, religion and the new atheists have a religion. It's called Western imperialism. So they want to bomb all the Muslims, not because they're satanic, but because they're barbarians. In fact, that need for a structure that is religious or quasi-religious in nature runs within the DNA of all of us, and the left is as susceptible of it. Orwell spent a lot of time writing about it. I think astutely. I mean, I don't like Manichaean views of the world, blacks and whites, good and evil. I that frightens me. And you know, like Primo Levi, I believe that the most dangerous evil is the evil we carry within us. But you know, too often messianic movements they see themselves as purifying forces, including the use of violence to purify, and they externalize evil. So evil becomes embodied in the other, and that can be done in secular terms, it can be done in religious terms. You know, religious ideology lends itself to that kind of worldview, but then you have to eradicate the other who embodies evil in order to create the perfect world. But that's not exclusive to religion, although religious institutions in particular, I saw it in Bosnia. I mean, the Serbian church signed on for the genocide. The Jewish, we have significant, and I don't want to minimize their importance, significant Jewish figures, Jewish Voices for Peace, etc., who have opposed the genocide. But, you know, the general thrust is that the institutions of Judaism have embraced genocide. The Christian church, the so-called German Christian church, embraced the Holocaust. The Puritans, I come from, both sides of my family came to the United States 400 years ago. They were all Puritans, and they had to cleanse the howling wilderness, they called it, of these satanic indigenous inhabitants. So I think that the left is very myopic to somehow blame religion. I mean, H. Richard Niebuhr, the theologian, said religion is a good thing for good people and a bad thing for bad people, because there are genocidal passages in the Bible of righteous genocide. It's there if you want to lift them out. Netanyahu has been lifting them out. So I think that that is a failure to understand a very human need, and that those impulses, while they often do come through institutional religion, because institutional religion at its core will sustain whatever nationalist project or racist project that it comes from. I mean, the Southern churches in the South, in the antebellum South, they owned slaves. They used to lease slaves out to make income. I mean, so, and they thundered from the pulpit as slavery being biblically justified. Which there are parts of the Bible where it is. I mean, there's no question. So I think the failure of the left is to somehow think that the problem is not is embodied in religion. It's not. It's embodied in within our own foibles and human nature. Just in terms of spirituality, it's a word I hate. You know, spirituality is come to be defined as kind of how is it with me, which is just narcissism. For me, spirituality comes with resistance. It comes with confronting radical evil, which if you truly confront it can be very, very dangerous. And I don't think it's accidental that I would argue two of the greatest prophets in American history, certainly of the 20th century, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, were deeply, deeply religious.
Chris, thank you very much for your time. This was a wonderful conversation.
Great. Thanks for doing it.
Have a wonderful
Hi,
rest.
my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.